In mid-June, my brother, my mom, and I all got to visit Great Smoky Mountains National Park for our first time. This is a place I've wanted to see for quite a while now, seeing as it's one of the most prominent national parks out east and the most visited national park in all of America. These days, you can typically rely on annual visitation numbers of around 13 million, which is substantially more than the second most visited park, Grand Canyon, which attracts over 5 million each year. Now, from what I hear, they do include vehicles that drive through to get from North Carolina to Tennessee and vice versa, as it's both a convenient rail and the rare national park that is free to enter. See, me personally, I wouldn't count that as a visit unless you got out and did something within its border, so with that in mind, is it really number one by attendance? Regardless, it's up there towards the top, and there are parts of the Smokies that can feel rather overcrowded. Throughout our 2.5 days here, we got to see all of the park's most popular and highly rated spots, which you can only really do if you go in with a well thought out plan. My hope is this video can help you with just that if the Great Smoky Mountains happen to be on your bucket list moving into the future. Now, a question you might be wondering is, what are the Smoky Mountains? Well, in short, the 522,427 acre park, divided almost evenly between the states of Tennessee and North Carolina, protect the majority of a subrange of the Blue Ridge Mountains, which itself is a subrange of the Appalachian Mountains. Aside from its height prominence reaching upwards of 6,643 feet, I'd always been curious about the smoky part. As it turns out, natural fog often hangs over the range, and I was hoping that was something we'd be able to see. Sure enough, it was like this for the majority of our time in the park, and that certainly gave it a unique characteristic that helped differentiate it from other mountain scenery in this region of America. Starting in Cherokee, North Carolina, we drove an hour to the other side of the park and were initially impressed by the layout and immersion on offer. It really did feel like so many other national parks with how spacious it was, all the trails right off the road, and the fact that said road follows a rather prominent river for dozens of miles. It was really scenic, and we were even lucky to catch a herd of elk pretty early in the morning. Wildlife is another strong suit of this park, and I was really holding out hope that we'd get to see its most iconic fauna, the black bear, at some point during our 2.5 days. Stay tuned to the end to see if we lucked out. Along the way, we also stopped at a handful of roadside overlooks in order to get our first views of the mountains. Unlike a place like Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, which is by far the closest park I'd compare to this one, there actually aren't too many overlooks overall. It became obvious that hiking was far more prominent in the Smokies, but we still saw two that I'd recommend to break up your drives. Morton Overlook is pleasant, but not amazing. It faces west into a gap between a handful of mountains, which again is pretty, but for the best views you really want to be above these peaks. I'd say the one exception was Chimney Overlook, just because of the super cool ridges that come off the mountains in this area. You can also see the actual chimney tops to the very left, which we'd attempt to climb on the Chimney Trail later on in the video. This was a great way to build anticipation, but was still a quick stop overall. Our first hike in the park was Laurel Falls, which I wanted to get out of the way first because I knew it was extremely popular. Even though we got there relatively early, we still had to wait like 20 minutes for our parking spot, so my mom ended up letting us out the car and said she'd catch up with us later. This wouldn't be the last time we need her help in this park, so shout out Mom. Another thing, to park in any of the lots at Great Smoky Mountains, you do need to grab a parking pass at either the visitor center or some other location in the park that sells them. You can check the park website for more specifics. The hike itself is 2.5 miles round trip with spurts of elevation gain here and there, but nothing too bad. It takes you through a pleasant forest that occasionally opened up, revealing a distant view of the mountains. But this was still rather scarce, so the trail wasn't the most eventful. And I'll tell you what, neither was the waterfall. I had seen pictures and videos of Laurel Falls and knew it probably wasn't going to be worth the hassle of parking and hiking to reach it, but I nevertheless wanted to document it for this video, seeing as it's such a popular location. Maybe the most popular location if you can believe it. I think Laurel Falls is the most overrated spot in any national park I've ever been to, and with all the amazing things we'd go and see in the Smokies, I have no idea why these falls are so overrun with tourists. Could it be because it's a relatively easy hike to a waterfall? Yeah, maybe, but if you watched my last video, you'll know this part of the country is littered with waterfalls that are both much more impressive and even easier to get to in many instances. To prove my point, I'll show you guys a super cool one literally right outside park boundaries that check each of these boxes, but we still got quite a bit to cover before then. And by the way, I don't want to make it sound like Laurel Falls was unenjoyable, because in all fairness, there were good qualities. Like, I enjoyed the waterfall for what it was, but no doubt it was the weakest we saw on the entire trip, and it's not close. There are so many other places in this park far more worth your time. A scenic 25-minute drive back the direction we came took us to the aforementioned Chimney Trail. Much to my surprise, this was not very busy, and not to be extreme, but the experience here was 30 times better than that of Laurel Falls. It's absolutely one of the park's standout trails. Chimney Tops is 3.5 miles out and back, which doesn't sound bad, but condensed within 1 3/4 of a mile one way is 1,286 feet of elevation gain. This was honestly one of the most challenging and grueling hikes I'd been on in a while, but we all killed it. Considering my brother hadn't been on a long hike in a while, and my mom isn't accustomed to this at all, we made great time and ended up feeling very accomplished by the end. Though I will say, the sheer amount of stairs is no joke. The design as they twist their way up the mountainside was quite beautiful, but seriously, so difficult. Whenever you thought maybe there'd be a flat section at the top, nope, more stairs. And it didn't help that there wasn't a whole lot of scenery change going up to the top, though once you get there, the mountain views are amazing. There's a few observation areas for you to look north facing the higher elevations like Mount LeConte, and if you continue a bit further you can see the namesake of the hike, the Chimney tops. This is a double capstone knob that is one of the few instances of a bare rock summit in the Smokies. Now I know what you're thinking, is it possible to summit that wizard's hat looking thing? And the answer is, sort of. See, you used to be able to bypass this gate no problem, but after a wildfire made conditions unsafe in 2016, they closed the trail beyond this point, and that's totally understandable. But a few years had gone by and a few curious individuals decided to bypass the gate to check things out. Sure enough, the area had recovered and the trail was as safe as it was before, but the National Park Service failed to reopen it, likely because they wanted to avoid injuries on the rock formation. So once word got out, tons of people started to proceed beyond this point, which is easy to do by simply ducking under the side railing and going around. From there, since the trail's unmaintained, you will have to do some bushwhacking, but beyond that, the path to the summit is the same as it was pre-fire. Now going in, I thought for sure we'd be able to complete this, but it gets really steep and narrow, which ended up giving me a miniature heart attack. I stopped about halfway up, which is something I'd never ever do unless it was legitimately frightening, which it was. Other people that were out on chimney tops did manage to get to the top, and to that I say good for them, but I didn't feel super inclined once I found out the views were more or less the same from even the base. I was completely blown away by the scenery and heights on both sides, as well as the smokiness this park gets its name from. Facing back towards the ridgeline was awesome and looked totally epic, but my favorite view was looking west towards all the other ridges you could see earlier from the Chimney Tops overlook. Honestly though, it is hard to pick favorites, because everywhere you look, it was incredible and such a great payoff to this trail. I would ultimately rank it up there as one of, if not my favorite hike I'd been on in 2024 so far, but the best is yet to come in this beautiful national park. Once we had completed this hike, our bodies were desperately in need of a food and rest break, so we headed back outside the park where we started in the town of Cherokee. Here we enjoyed a nice pizza and took shelter as some powerful rain came over the next couple hours. Believe it or not, this is precisely what I was hoping would happen, as our next spot was a waterfall that hadn't been flowing very well from the images I'd seen the past couple of days. Though Mingo Falls is located outside the national park, for all intents and purposes I include it since the border is like a mile or two away and because the scenery doesn't change whatsoever. The trail to reach its base is just 0.3 miles out and back, but I was surprised to see it was rated moderate on all trails. As it turns out, this is because the entire thing consists of stairs, and more stairs. Still, I personally found it rather easy despite the PTSD we all had from the stairs on the Chimney Tops trail. No, but in all seriousness, this is precisely what I was talking about earlier. Mingo Falls is very impressive and didn't require much effort to get to at all. It stands 120 feet tall, making it one of the tallest and most spectacular waterfalls in southern Appalachia. And as you can see, the flow was amazing coming off the heels of that rainstorm. I was incredibly pleased by our results and would consider this a must-stop for those visiting Great Smoky Mountains. It is possible you'll have to make a bit of a detour to see it, but in my eyes, it's easily worth it. In an attempt to enjoy a sunset over the mountains, we then made our way to Clingmans Dome, which is one of the most popular spots in the park. It's situated right down the border between North Carolina and Tennessee and is a summit observation tower providing panoramic views from the highest point in the park. Unfortunately, our first try was a bust, as the top of the mountain was completely engulfed by clouds. There really wasn't much to see, which was very disappointing at the time. But with the flexibility offered by my itinerary, we vouched to come back a few days later when the visibility was clearer, so stay tuned to see if we got our view. Lots of cliffhangers in this video, huh? This concluded our first day in Great Smoky Mountains, and it was vital for us to get a long night of sleep to make way for a very strenuous journey the next day to the top of Mount LeConte. This is roughly 11 miles out and back to the highest point you can hike to in the Smokies. Like with so many other locations in this park, the parking lot can fill up super early, but since this was probably a bit too much for my mom, she offered to drop us off and pick us up later, which made things much easier. Now, a hike this long I normally wouldn't have even done in the east, since I had experienced a lack of variety in the trails here, but my friend Evan, who lives not too far away and joined us for the day, told us Mount LeConte was very much an exception to this. And I wholeheartedly agree, because there was so much happening and so much to look at, I really didn't get bored or even tired the entire time. You begin along a really picturesque creek that the trail interacts with beautifully. There's all these narrow bridges that cross over it, and not only do they look cool, but it's a lot of fun to cross them as well. One of these bridges lead you into the entrance of Arch Rock, the first prominent feature that makes this hike so enjoyable from start to finish. It's surprisingly massive, and once again I love how the trail interacts with it, passing right on through. The arch was formed by freezing and thawing, which eroded away the softer rock from underneath the harder rock, which is what you see today. Right after this, you'll begin to see your first sections of cable that the park positions on the right side of the trail for those who need help passing narrow sections with potentially large drop-offs. Even when it wasn't needed, this was a really cool element that just looks badass and helps with accessibility for less experienced hikers. Beyond this point, you begin to see the first of a whole bunch of mountain views that are abundant throughout the majority of the rest of the way to the top. It was a great way to build anticipation, plus by the time you reach these heights, there are some really nice wildflowers that start to form, only adding to the scenery. The next prominent feature that appears is Alum Cave, which many people hike to and back from, which would already make for a spectacular hike in of itself. Despite its name though, this is not a cave, it's a huge bluff overhang. It formed the same way Arch Rock did, but as you can see it's a whole hell of a lot bigger in comparison. Between these two and the chimney tops, I was blown away by the fascinating display of rock formations found in the Smokies, as it's something I wasn't expecting to such a degree before my visit. Alum Cave offers a nice shaded place to sit and catch a break for those continuing up to Mount LeConte summit. If I had to guess, this is about the halfway point to the top, and while the second half of the hike doesn't have quite as much scenery change, it still more than gets the job done. It alternates between going into the forestry and opening up to expansive mountain views, also featuring a number of really cool cable sections. As we approached the summit, I had noticed something rather interesting happen that I wasn't expecting in the slightest. The forest all around us had changed completely. On top of that, the temperature was significantly cooler, probably a good 10 to 15 degree difference if I had to take a guess. It was one of the trippiest things I've experienced on a hike, but honestly, it might have been my favorite part of the entire journey. The alpine forest was stunning beyond words, with moss covering all of the trees and ferns covering the ground. I guess you just don't see much of this out here since the majority of the mountains don't get this height, but I thought it was way cool and a great addition to the hike. Eventually the trail splits off and you'll have to choose to either go a few miles further to Myrtle Point or wrap around to the cliff tops viewpoint. We did both, but not knowing how long the clouds would stay out of the way, we booked it to the former as I had been told it was the more expansive overlook from the summit. Sure enough, it was a mind-blowing vantage point, and when I saw it, I felt so rewarded by our efforts. We had climbed to the top of a 6,593-foot mountain. Even with the clouds blocking the silhouette of distant mountains, there was no way I was going to complain about the visibility, as many people devote hours to getting all the way up here only for there to be nothing to look at. Just think about our experience at Clingmans Dome. Could you imagine if we had made it and saw the inside of a cloud from the top? And just like that, we've completed the hike to Myrtle Point. This has been an absolute delight, and definitely my favorite hike I've done so far in the east with my brother, who was just eating an apple, and Evan. It's so good to have you guys here.
Yeah, it's an amazing hike.
Cliff Tops was outstanding as well, and perhaps the better of the two overlooks in my humble opinion. I love how you're right beside this massive ridge that has these exposed mossy rocks hanging out over the side. Plus, the mountains were almost keeping the cloud out like a force field or something. I had never seen anything like it, but the Smoky Mountains sure did live up to their name. The other direction revealed a similar view to that of Myrtle Point, just as impressive and huge. Beyond what I've already mentioned, I have so much leftover footage which I think calls for a compilation. But before we let it roll, I wanted to give some final thoughts on Mount LeConte, and literally everything I have to say is positive. I know I keep mentioning this, but after doing so many hikes in this region that just felt lacking in variety, I was pleased to see that this trail captures all of what makes this national park special. The mountains, the rock formations, the forests, the water, the atmosphere, and the list goes on. I'd honestly put it up there as one of the most diverse hikes I've done in a national park, and possibly one of my all-time favorites. It's a grind for sure, there's no question about it, but if you can only do one thing in the Smoky Mountains, Mount LeConte is where it's at. In total, the hike to Mount LeConte took us about 6.5 hours, and keep in mind we're the type of people to hike fast, but we were also taking a lot of time to enjoy the views. It's not like we finished all that late, but we were done for the remainder of the day, so we enjoyed a few hours exploring Pigeon Forge once we finished. While we're on the topic, I want to give a shout out to the Apple Barn, which we ate at for dinner that night. It's like a true authentic southern restaurant with some really spectacular food and a few unique offerings as well. Rather than bread, they provide apple fritters, which you can then dip in apple butter, as well as apple julep, which might have been the biggest surprise of it all. For a main course, I got this pasta dish with chicken, which wasn't very southern, but my god was it delicious. Look, I have nothing to gain, and frankly they don't either from me saying this because the Apple Barn is already extremely popular, but this was one of those food spots that lived up to expectations for me. I loved it so much, and I'd highly recommend trying it after a long hike like Mount LeConte. Another thing about Pigeon Forge I absolutely adore is the Dollywood theme park, which is one of my favorites anywhere in the world. If that sounds like something you might be interested in, I should already have a Dollywood vlog published on my other channel, Coaster Dash. For day 3, we set out to check out a highly discussed portion of the Great Smoky Mountains that requires quite the detour to get to. For reference, it takes about an hour to get there from Laurel Falls and 2 hours from Clingmans Dome. Known as Cades Cove, this is located on the western side of the park and is renowned for its wildlife viewing opportunities. Now, a lot of the time, driving through this place can be a headache due to the sheer amount of cars and traffic. But every Wednesday, they do something that I find so cool, and that's close the 11-mile loop road to motor vehicles. So you can either walk, or more frequently, people will rent bikes at the Cades Cove campground and circle the loop that way. This was precisely my plan, as I figured it would be a great way to enjoy some peace and quiet in this area, along with increasing the likelihood of seeing wildlife such as black bears, as they tend to come out more frequently when less people are around. On Wednesdays, first come first serve bike rentals begin at 7 a.m., and since we had an hour drive to get here, we woke up at 4:30 in the morning to make it happen. Much to our amazement, there was already quite a long line when we got there, but supposedly they don't sell out for a while, which is nice. The cost of renting here is $15 an hour, which I'd say is fair given how great of an experience it is. Literally within a few minutes of having our bikes, we stumbled upon our first couple of black bears right at the entrance of the loop road. I couldn't believe it happened so soon, though unfortunately they were hiding behind a bunch of trees, making them rather difficult to spot. Spoiler alert, this wouldn't be the last time we'd see them, but in general, coming here was already a success for me, as we got what we came here for. But putting the wildlife aside for a second, Cades Cove is also stunningly beautiful in its own right, with a huge valley in the middle surrounded by pretty large mountains. There's lots of viewpoints for you to stop at, and whenever there's a crowd of bikers pulled over, you'll know when it's time to view wildlife.
It's so beautiful out here, man. Such an incredible, peaceful ride. We already saw 4 bears within the first 5 minutes on the loop road. Incredible.
I was surprised that we didn't see much wildlife during the majority of our time here, not even deer or elk or anything. But well into the latter half, we had seen another large black bear way back in the trees. Again, this was great, we got to see bears, but it's not close enough to where you can really get a good look or a good video shot. Another thing, this was my first time on a bike in literally years, and I was surprised by how easy it was to operate one. There were some steep sections where you had to really pedal, or you could do what most people did and walk it up to the top. Every single time though, no matter how tough it was to get up the hill, it was always worth it so that you could go down it. Occasionally there would be a very long section where you're just going at a pretty good clip and don't even need to pedal, which was so enjoyable. So overall, the whole experience at Cades Cove was just very relaxing and not at all what I'd expect from one of the most visited national parks. But the kicker?
Oh my lord.
Look at these cute little white bears and
We had witnessed all 4 bears move their way across the road, and it was the most incredible wildlife viewing experience of the entire trip. I was in disbelief that we had just seen that for the remainder of the day, and Cades Cove had cemented itself as another must-visit area of the park. To wrap up our time here, it was time to head back to Clingmans Dome to see if we'd have better luck with visibility. Since we had other places to be that day, I accepted the fact that we wouldn't get to see a sunset here, but most importantly was that I got to see the view at all. It still wasn't totally clear, but that's okay, I still thought the scenery was awesome. Every direction had spectacular mountain peaks, and I'll add that I think the observation tower is a really cool feature. The spiral design is really satisfying, and it's cool that it's positioned atop the highest mountain in the national park at 6,644 feet. Additionally, it happens to be the highest point in Tennessee, but not North Carolina. Altogether, while the natural beauty is spectacular from up here, I personally did prefer the overlooks from the top of Chimney tops or Mount LeConte. Nonetheless, it's well worth the visit and a great way to conclude our time in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I honestly wasn't sure what to expect going into this one, as I've heard conflicting reviews from those close to me in this community. Don't get me wrong, I can see how the experience could be underwhelming if crowds are a huge problem, but I find that if you tackle the most popular spots early and save the less busy spots for the right time, you can end up having an amazing visit here. This was definitely true for us, as we ended up doing just that and enjoyed this park stress-free. The scenery here, while not the most mind-blowing for a national park, absolutely gets the job done, and the way the hiking trails were designed into the environment was exceptional. On top of that, we ended up getting pretty lucky with wildlife when everything was said and done, which put a nice bow onto our experience. As far as a ranking, it's definitely not in my top 10 national parks, but it's relatively close as I think it's a great full package with lots to offer. Certainly it's my favorite park on the east at this point, and I'd be curious whether or not Acadia National Park in Maine could top it for me. That said, I'd absolutely suggest you visit the Smokies. It made for an excellent centerpiece to our road trip. But I'd like to hear from you now. What do you think of this national park? If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to Travel Dash for more content like this in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye guys.